أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول أشهد أن محمد.
Hello, welcome to another and a continuing episode of Islam in Focus. I'm your host, Hamid Rashid. Today we continue with our series dealing with sources of Islam, continuation of the discussion of the topic of authorship of the Quran. I have joined me on the program, as usual, Dr. Jamal Badawi of St. Mary's University. Brother Jamal, Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
Could I have you very quickly, as is our fashion, summarize the main points that we touched on in our program last week?
Certainly. Well, last week, Brother Hamid, was a continuation of the discussion of the theory that claims that the Quran could have been just a sort of vision that the Prophet sincerely thought it were true, that it emanated mainly from his own subconscious. And we indicated that the contents of the Quran includes prophecies that came to pass with the minutest detail, which of course would not be something that proceeds from one's own thinking.
Mm-hmm.
Secondly, we mentioned that the Quran contains certain passages which even blames the Prophet or correct him in a very severe term, even though it was a result of a very innocent interpretation done out of very good intention, but God wanted something different, and nobody authors something that really blames him for something that nobody even noticed. It was a mistake at all, with all good intention. Thirdly, we indicated that he's gone through suffering himself, and accusation that were made against his wife, and still for a whole month he could not say anything until the revelation came. If he were to author that, he could have said and got himself out of this difficulty and waiting. Thirdly, there were some passages in the Quran that were revealed whose wisdom was known much later, and people asked him and he couldn't answer until much later when the revelation came to clarify the issue. And again, how could one's own self-revelation reveal to oneself something that he himself doesn't understand? So we said that the basis of that is very, very, really incoherent. There could be no explanation of the Quran as emanating from the Prophet at all.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'd like to turn now to an examination of perhaps yet another possibility that might be suggested, at least for the purposes of clarification. There may be those who say that you haven't touched on the possibility that the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, might have learned the Quran from some other source. Mm-hmm. What would your response be to that suggestion?
Okay. Well, first of all, just by way of cross-reference, a part of the answer to that question may relate to what was covered in a previous program, at least one issue, that this implies, or this assumption implies, that he did not tell the truth when he said the Quran has come from Allah, and we have already analyzed from the study of his own character, recognition of his own enemies, that this is not the type of person who would just falsify things and, for that purpose. But like I said, for purpose of clarification, maybe you could go beyond that and put the question to further analysis. Now, the question here is this: if the Prophet really learned the Quran or the teachings of Islam from somebody around him, then who is that person and in what context?
Mm-hmm.
We all know that the Prophet was unlettered.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't know how to read or write until he died. Secondly, we also know that he was raised in a community or environment which was predominantly a pagan community. It wasn't people who believed in some form of monotheism, as the Quran indicated, that were insisted on monotheism, so one cannot make any connection really there. Indeed, if one were to be skeptical, he would be least skeptical, or should be least skeptical about Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, in terms of learning from someone else or absorbing from his environment. Because take, for example, the case of Prophets Moses and Jesus, peace be upon them. Moses was raised in the midst of the house of the Pharaoh, in civilization and religious argument and discussions. So if anyone was skeptical, he would say, all right, maybe Moses might have learned. Jesus, peace be upon him, was raised in Jerusalem, the heart of, again, the Hebrew tradition, and he learned a lot, and according to the New Testament, he engaged in lots of discussions with the Jewish scholars. Well, again, if one were to be skeptical, he may raise a question. I'm not saying that there is any reason to doubt, because by the authority of the Quran, the Muslim believes that both Moses and Jesus were genuine prophets of Allah, or God, and that they received revelation from that. But I'm simply saying, if there was any question to be raised, even, it is least applicable to the case of Prophet Muhammad, who was unlettered and raised in a community or environment which was not really monotheistic in orientation, where some doubt might be there about the source of the Quran.
Mm-hmm. Is there any question about that? You know, you mentioned that Prophet Muhammad was raised in an environment that was predominantly pagan. Was there any exceptions to that?
Well, of course, needless to say that in any community, of course, there are some exceptions. You could not say that 100% of them were pagans. I think that would not be a fair statement for me to make. But again, we're talking about the predominant atmosphere and predominant culture, if you will. Because, for example, some historians refer to one exception, a very minor one that doesn't have any significance. They refer to a few individuals who could be counted perhaps on one hand, who used to call themselves Hanifis. That is, people who did not participate particularly in the mode of worship or idol worship that the other Arabs used to do. They used to have a different way of contemplating or meditating about God, but they did not constitute a religion really as such. They did not have a church, they didn't have any organized thing, no scriptures, no set of teaching. And that is, far from having any relevance really to the very comprehensive coverage of the Quran in various aspects of history, creed, hereafter, life here, economic, social, political. I mean, there's nothing really that can be correlated at all. And there is no record that we know of historically that they had any record even of their the set of what they believed. It was just a vague feeling or vague notion of monotheism, which might have come down to them since the days of Abraham and Ishmael, but just a vague, unstructured type of thing. In addition to this, one cannot eliminate also the fact that there were already maybe a few individuals who might have not necessarily been pagans. Some might have had some Christian background in Mecca even itself. Mm-hmm. But in fact, those few people, as historians tell us, were not necessarily of the predominant culture. It was just like a separate subculture that was not intermingling much with the other Qurayshites, the Arabs. Many of them were not allowed, or as a principle, in fact, they were not allowed to have any residence nearby the Kaaba, because the Kaaba was regarded as the most holy shrine, even among pagans. They respected so much, so they kept them at the outskirts of the city of Mecca. In addition, like historians also indicate, they were usually among the less literate or mostly illiterate people who were just like workers, sometimes domestic servants, but not really people who have any influence on the culture or any level of learning whereby they could have possibly been responsible. So this kind of caliber cannot be really an explanation of the comprehensive coverage and the wisdom that is contained in the Quran. In fact, the Quran itself at one point even referred to some of those unfounded, if you will, accusation that some of the pagans did, and actually made a very logical and very strong rebuttal of it.
Well, could you tell us, explain for us what the Quran has to say with respect to this and the nature of the rebuttals contained in the Quran?
Okay, before I get to the quotation of the passage in the Quran, perhaps a little background would be useful.
Yes.
For example, some of those who were really desperate to discredit the Prophet in his time, to find some way of disclaiming the origin, the divine source of the Quran, they started throwing all kinds of accusations, and one of which they say, all right, if we can't really prove, that the Quran is not coming from a divine source, maybe we should throw some doubt. So they said, all right, he learned from a Christian Roman blacksmith. And what happened really is that there was actually that person. And he used to work in his shop. And the Prophet sometimes just got some curiosity to find out how he's doing that. So he used to sit out or stand and watch that blacksmith doing his work. I mean, aside from the fact that it is very unreasonable to assume that in the midst of fire, banging and smoke, that the Prophet would learn from such an illiterate person all the high concepts of monotheism that we find in the Quran and all the other contents organizing human life and relating the human to the Creator. I mean, it's totally irrelevant. However, the Quran puts it very nicely and shows a very important logical flow in this accusation. And that appears in Surah 16, particularly in passage 103. وَلَقَدْ نَعْلَمُ أَنَّهُمْ يَقُولُونَ إِنَّمَا يُعَلِّمُهُ بَشَرٌ لِسَانُ الَّذِي يُلْحِدُونَ إِلَيْهِ أَعْجَمِيٌّ وَهَذَا لِسَانٌ عَرَبِيٌّ مُبِينٌ. That in that passage God says, we know indeed that they say it is a human who teaches him, that is, teaches the Prophet. The tongue or the language of him they wickedly point out, that is the blacksmith, is notably foreign, while this Quran is in pure and clear Arabic. So the point here is that that fellow, actually all he knew of Arabic was just broken Arabic. How could a person who is with that foreign tongue, with broken Arabic, be the teacher of the Prophet in producing a book that is the Quran, which for 1400 years challenged the most eloquent of the eloquent to produce something similar to it? That logic is similar to saying that a Chinese immigrant in Britain was the one who taught Shakespeare. Mm-hmm. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense at all. Mm-hmm. So this is one of the examples of, at least that are known in history, who were not necessarily pagans, but obviously there's absolutely no ground really to relate the source of the Quran to him. Mm-hmm.
Well, now, aside from this Roman blacksmith that you've just been speaking of, were there other Jews or Christians in Mecca who were perhaps more learned? And if so, to what extent was the Prophet in contact with any of these people?
Yes, there was a notable case that's known and recorded in history, and we have lots of information on that. And that was an old man who was blind towards the end of his life, by the name of Waraqah ibn Nawfal. That man actually was a cousin or relative of Khadija, the wife of the Prophet, peace be upon him. And some historians say that even though he comes from, Arabic descent, that he became Christian at one point in his life, and he had some knowledge actually of the New Testament. However, if you really look at it clearly in terms of the extent of his acquaintance with the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him,
yes,
we don't see any connection at all. In fact, there are only two incidents that we have some information on historically of encounters between that man and the Prophet. One, it says that when Waraqah was going around the Kaaba, mm-hmm, for their turning around the Kaaba, one time he encountered Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and he affectionately kissed his head. The other occasion is an incident which is very well documented, and all the details about it we have record of, and that is his encounter with Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, after Prophet Muhammad received the first revelation. Yeah. But neither of them really can give any indication at all of.
Could you shed some light on that latter contact you just been talking about?
The question of revelation?
Right.
Okay, well, briefly speaking, because that also can be discussed perhaps in the context of Islamic history or the life of the Prophet. But as it relates to the discussion here, well, basically when Prophet Muhammad was meditating in the cave of Hira outside of Mecca, top of the mountain, and the angel of revelation, Gabriel, came to him the first time, he came down trembled and afraid, because as we mentioned in a previous program, he never anticipated or hoped to be a prophet or anything, and he wasn't sure even whether this is a genuine angel of revelation or whether this could be an evil spirit or something. And he rushed trembling to his wife Khadija, who took him to that relative of hers, Waraqa. And Waraqa asked him a number of questions as to, what's the description, what exactly happened to you. And he concluded clearly, and he said that this, by the name of God, is the same angel of revelation who came to prophets before. And he said to Khadija that your husband would be a very important person. He would have a great influence. Some historians say that he said actually that this is the long-awaited prophet. And in fact, he gave a prophecy also, an indication. He said, you will be driven out of your home, and if this happened to you, I would really give you all the support I could muster. So the prophet asked him, are they going to drive me out of my home? He said, there is no prophet in history who came with a teaching that are similar to what you began to receive, except that he was opposed and driven out by his people. He refers to opposition and persecution. And after this, it is said that the Waraqa, that man, shortly died. Again, there's no connection here for a very simple reason. The most trustworthy references indicate that he died very early. And we know that the revelation of the Quran came to the Prophet over a period of 23 years. And they conclude that he must have died within the first 3 years. And the Quran continued for 20 more years after his death, because he was already advanced in age and blind, as they describe him as. So, again, looking at it this way, I don't think there's any connection.
That this could have been a possible source. Well, the discussion that we've had to this point is basically focused on Mecca. Some people may wonder whether or not the Prophet might have learned some of the religious teachings from other Jews and Christians in other parts of the Arabian Peninsula. How would you respond to somebody who would make that suggestion, where he was a traveler and traveled quite frequently?
Okay, well, let's take first the question of the Arabian Peninsula itself. I think this is a matter that should be related to both history and geography. Yes, there were some Christian tribes living in Najran, known as the Christians of Najran, and that was in what we call today Yemen. That's to the south of Mecca. To the north, yes, there were some Jewish tribes living in Yathrib, which came to be known later as Medina. All right? However, it's interesting to notice that there is absolutely no evidence or record in history about Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, traveling to Najran, to Yemen, either before he was commissioned or giving the responsibility of prophethood, or after that. There's absolutely nothing that we know of about it. So that removes that. Secondly, with respect to the Jews living in Medina, let's realize again that number one, the Prophet was not recorded to have gone to Medina before prophethood, except when he was 6 years old, in the company of his mother, to visit her relatives, Bani Najjar, in what is now Medina, and to let the Prophet Muhammad visit the grave of his father, because his father died while he was still in the womb of his mother.
Yes.
So I don't think we could say that at the age of 6, a person going to Medina have learned all the Judaic concepts and the information about the Old Testament. Furthermore, you're talking here about a place which is hundreds of kilometers away from Mecca. And that's not 1 hour flight in a jumbo jet, nor is it a matter of 4 or 5 hours driving on a super highway. You're talking here about a place in the context of the transportation methods of the 7th century. You're really talking about traveling by camel, on board a camel or horse for perhaps weeks. So you really don't see any connection at all between the existence of those communities far away from the immediate environment where the Prophet was located. There could be no...
Well, some non-Muslim writers about Islam have claimed that there were occasions when the Prophet was engaged in discussions with learned Jews and Christians, including priests. I might understand from what you've said at this point that this is not true.
It is true, but sometimes the timing is not mentioned with it. Timing is very crucial.
Yes.
You see, the emphasis in my answers in the previous questions was that is before he was commissioned as a prophet and started to receive the revelation of the Quran, did he have any contact? And that makes a big difference. Because, yes, there were incidents, and the Quran even refers to the dialogue or discussion between the Prophet and Jewish and Christian religious leaders. But that has taken place long after actually he became a prophet, and long after so much of the Quran was already revealed. Many of these discussions has taken place in Medina after the Prophet migrated, and we know that he stayed in Mecca for 13 years. So you're really talking about more than 13 years after the beginning of his mission as a prophet of God. So that the time here is very, very crucial. How could he learn from them if he has already taught so much about the teaching of the Islam and revealed so much revelations in the form of the Quran? That's another thing. The second thing, in addition to timing, is the context where he met with them. Did he meet with them as a student learning from them, or as a teacher and inviter and corrector even of some of the notions that they used to claim?
Yes.
And history tells us that he met them as a prophet to invite them to the path of Islam, to indicate to them and correct some of the dogmas that they have introduced into the pure monotheistic faith of Allah. The Quran refers, for example, his discussion about correction of the notions of like Trinity and other notion that many of those people have. A third aspect that should be related here, that many of those religious notables actually ended up following him and becoming his students themselves. The history tells us of the names of very learned people like Abdullah ibn Salam, Ka'b al-Ahbar, Salman. All of these individuals were known to have good knowledge, especially the first two. And in fact, the Quran in chapter or Surah 5, in Ayah 85, makes reference to some of them actually when they heard, were very religious leaders and very notable learned scholars. When they heard the recitation of the Prophet, their eyes were flowing with tears, and they believed in the Prophet because they said that we believe in the what has been revealed to us and the truth that has been coming, that is through the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. So yes, there was this meeting, but when, in what context and in what capacity is quite revealing and interesting.
But to go back to this point about traveling, we know that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, traveled extensively. That was part of his trade in the early years. A common statement in many of the writings about Islam is that even if the Prophet did not learn about the creeds from anyone in Arabia, he must have learned that through his travels, his other travels. How correct could you say that statement?
Okay. Well, the first correction to that common statement, I agree. It's very common. But common is one thing and correct is not necessarily the same. Those who used to travel extensively are the Qurayshites in general, and the Quran make reference to that, in fact, in a surah or chapter called Quraysh, that they used to have a trip in the summer and winter. In the summer they used to go north to Syria. In the winter they go south to Yemen for the purpose of trade. But that generalization about the Arabs in general, or those who were involved in that trade, does not necessarily mean that the Prophet was involved in all of these travels. In fact, historically we know of two travels outside of the Arabian Peninsula made by the Prophet, peace be upon him. And one was when he was 9, and some other version perhaps no more than 12 years of age in the company of his uncle Abu Talib when they went to Syria for trading purposes on a caravan. And obviously you cannot say that at that age a person would learn something that people spend all their lives learning. And even in one of the stories, for example, narrated in at Tirmidhi, that on the way, in that trip when he was a young boy, one Christian monk, some even give his name as Bahira, saw certain strange signs about the Prophet. He asked him some questions, and he warned his uncle. He said that this is the anticipated or long-awaited Prophet, and be careful because some people might hurt him if they know, and actually advised him to go back as soon as possible. There are lots of details that we can discuss perhaps in the issue of the lifetime of the Prophet. But of course it's obvious here that in a caravan passing casually by a monk resting for a couple of hours from the heat of the sun, a 9 or even 12 years old boy would learn all the secrets of theology and come up with something that really has enlightened the hearts of millions or hundreds of millions of people throughout history. Is really too grand assumption to make. The second incident where there is record of his travel was when he was 25 years old after he married Khadija. And he was responsible for her caravan. And imagine a person again traveling with full responsibility of a whole caravan, busy buying and selling, negotiating, packing and getting ready to go back, that in this casual discussion that might have taken place or broad conversation with other merchants, that he learned again something that would result in faith that is of the magnitude of Islam and as comprehensive as what the Quran contains. I should add really that not only historically do we find that this kind of claim is unjustified, but it cannot be justified even on simple logical grounds here.
Well, when you say it can't be justified on logical grounds, could you explain what you mean by that?
Okay. I mean by that aside from the historical fact that there is no clear indication at all of anything that can be traced or resemble a possible source from which Prophet Muhammad might have learned the Quran, and that there are additional reasons also. Number one, the life of the Prophet was open to all, and the Quran actually testifies to that fact in Surah 49, for example, that he didn't even have sufficient privacy in his own home because people were around him at all times. They were trying to record each and every word that he said. They tried to observe his action as the model for them. And if this is the case, or if this was the case, how could it be that he was secretly in the presence of all people around him at all times?
Yes.
Go and meet with that teacher and learn the Quran from him, and then come every once in a while and say this is a new part of the Quran, because as you said it was revealed in piecemeals. How could he escape these open eyes around him all the time? And these eyes included people who were staunchly independent and strong personalities like Abu Bakr and Uthman and others. How could such wise people believe in him and sacrifice their property and lives and put it on the line in defense of what he teaches if they know that he is not telling the truth, and they know because they're close to him that he learned from some other source? How could it be that even a person who was his enemy, like Umar, who was a very strong person, very wise person, but he was an enemy of Islam and Muslims at the beginning, how could he turn around and follow the Prophet and offer his life even, or put it on the line in defense of Islam and what he saw as the truth, if there were any such kind of teacher? But let's leave even his followers. Somebody might say they might have bewitched or something. How about his enemies? And his enemies were keeping their eyes open for any flaw or mistake or anything that may justify their accusation that he was a false prophet or that he was claiming something that he was learning from someone else. If they were such a teacher, they would have made a big noise about it and say, no, not only that he learned from others, and that's his name, and that's where we caught him learning from him. And what kind of teacher let the Prophet learn all that without claiming the credit himself?
Yes, yes.
See, it has to be an invisible type of teacher that evaded all of those people. If there was another teacher, it was none but Gabriel, the angel of revelation. And that's the only viable explanation.
Well, on that note, I think we'll conclude our program for today. We want to thank you all for watching. Invite you back next week when we'll continue with our series dealing with the sources of Islam. Assalamu alaikum. Peace be unto you.
أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدا